Evening, everyone. Really good to see you all. Thanks for joining me. Lovely to see some familiar faces as well. So you're more than welcome to this session where I want to explore really the first of probably a few of these Thursday night ones. Really is a lot of territory we can cover in the context of embodied practice and body scans in particular. But this one, I want to look at how body-based practices and really a classic body scan, I'll define what I mean by that in a bit, how that can be maybe looked at and considered and possibly adapted for different groups. What I'd like to do to begin with, though, is a practice that just kind of gets us kind of in the territory maybe of more kind of embodied awareness. And what I suggested you might want to do if you do want to give this a go is have an object you like the feel of if you're holding it. I'll probably start rustling a lot because an object I particularly like the feel of is beanbag. So it might be rustling away in the background at times. But it could be a hot drink or cold drink, or it could be if you have a pet handy, or indeed a small child then who's willing, then any kind of anything that's kind of good to hold in your hand or having contact with your hand would be great to start. And I want to just kind of jump into this one. So I'm not particularly going to set it up with any beginnings or ends as such. It's just one I wanted to kind of come in with and see how we go. So assume you've got some kind of object to hand, which could, if it could just be anything lying down around on your desk that just it kind of is available, or wherever you're sitting. But if you can just kind of take hold of that object and maybe just spend a few moments simply noticing what it's like to have that kind of object in contact with your hand in some way. And notice what stands out. Is it the texture, the temperature, the shape of it in some way? Are some parts of that object more obvious or available to notice than others? Kind of draws your attention in what kind of is hard to notice. So just being really attentive to the different experiences available with being in contact with that object. Choosing whether to have your eyes open or closed, perhaps. You might just want to play around with some time with eyes closed if that feels comfortable, even just for a few moments. How does the sensations there in your hand, or wherever the object's in contact, feel with eyes closed? Maybe opening your eyes, just finding somewhere comfortable to rest your gaze. What happens if your eyes are open? Noticing which you prefer. Or do you like alternating? Who knows? Or even one eye open, one eye closed. Whatever you kind of want to give a go on. Maybe noticing what it's like to have your hand more still or more active. So kind of playing around with what happens to the feeling of contact, if there are movements for a while, if there's less movement for a while. And if at any time we're doing this and you just think, had enough of that, prefer to take my attention somewhere else, or do something else entirely. So it could be have a daydream, a snooze, plan, shopping list, who knows what it might be, then just taking your attention away from this practice and doing kind of what's good for you. You can always dip back in a bit later if that's what you prefer as well. And then maybe noticing what it's like to really take your attention to a fine detail. Maybe one's been standing out already and you're already doing that. But is there somewhere in particular that you could kind of focus in on? And notice what it's like to really come into that fine contact. And as you're doing that, and if you notice your attention gets hooked by something, wanders off in some way, noticing how it is to come back to that fine detail. Could be maybe under the pad of a thumb or a finger where there's more sensory nerves. Maybe it's somewhere else. Do you notice anything happening as you really focus in? Do you notice your brow furrowing, your body getting a bit tense? What's it like to bring the attention in and kind of let things ease up around that if they have kind of got a bit tense with effort? Or if that tension just hangs around, notice what it's like to have that around as you're focusing in. So I'd like to come back to that particular place. And then widening out your attention. Notice how it is to come into maybe the feel of the whole object again, however you want that to be. Getting a feel of that object in contact with your hand at different places. Again, if you find your attention's getting hooked by something else, just notice that and gently bring your attention back to what you're noticing there. And that might be happening endlessly if there's loads of things like mindful of all kinds of stuff or stuff happening around you. It's all good. It's just a kind of practice where coming back endlessly from having your attention hooked away by your mind or other stuff going on. Dozing off, then it's coming back and dozing off. But then maybe seeing what it's like to experiment with now taking your attention more into the hand that's holding that particular object or in contact with it. So yeah, the object's still there, but around that, noticing maybe the feeling could be in the back of your hand or spaces between your fingers or the sense of the shape or position that your hand's in. Maybe mirroring that object. And notice whether that feels different in some way, coming more into your hand away from the object. Be more of a sense of liking, disliking, or not that bothered. Either way. And then what about taking your attention wider still into a sense of your arm, of the hand that's holding the objects? You've still got that kind of object there in your awareness in some way. There's a sense then of your hand and your arm with that object. And again, remembering any moment you feel you want to just kind of move on your attention elsewhere or go back to just the object, just doing what's right for you. And then what about having a sense of whatever position your body's in, that you're in this position with your arm, with the hand that's holding that object. So you've got the sense of your body. Maybe there's ways your body's being supported, perhaps from the floor or a chair or some other support. Sense of being kind of sat here with a sense of your body alongside that object you're holding. Then how is it to focus back in to just the object? Maybe even just that very fine place of fine detail before. And again, if your attention's wandering off elsewhere, getting hooked by stuff, coming back maybe to more of that sense of that object. Then finally, maybe noticing what it's like to put the object down. Or move your hand away in some ways. There's less of a sense of contact, whatever kind of works with what you're in contact with. And noticing the sense of absence of that object. Any kind of echoes, if I could call it that, any maybe fading but residual sense of what it was like to have had that object in contact with your hand in some way. What's it like to come back to those fading echoes? And then maybe just taking your attention more wider to maybe some movements, maybe moving hands, just noticing sensations in your hands as they move, maybe moving your feet around a bit, shifting on the floor perhaps. Your eyes are closed, maybe, excuse me, opening your eyes, maybe look around you, listening out for sounds you can hear, maybe shifting more if you can find a bit of a stretch, even a bit of a yawn, and whatever's kind of good for you just to bring that to a bit of an end. I'm kind of just curious about any kind of responses to that. Feel free to bob anything in the chat, or if you're okay, kind of coming with audio, you can put your hand up. You can, you can pause your hand. What am I trying to say? There's a raise hand button if you kind of move your mouse over the screen. I'm just kind of curious about that sense of being with the object and kind of moving more into body sense, and then coming back in. Any kind of responses to that as a possibility? There's a comment here. I really enjoyed. If I can find my teeth, I can really. I really enjoyed the detail. I still can't say it. I really enjoyed the attention to detail and our deepening connection with our body sensations. So thank you for that. But very gentle as the object and the sense of absence. Think of the word soothing coming in. Really interesting. Anyone had any more kind of negative experiences? Just that think, yeah, don't want to do that ever again, or would want to adapt it or change it. I think that's really interesting. When we give anything a test drive like that, what kind of fits, what doesn't fit for you? The object was a strong anchor and felt grounding to be in touch with another comment, and someone else really struck by the absences there. Yeah, so that sense and noticing a sense of grief when the object wasn't in your hand. So really important, the sense of how, we as human beings, we attach, and that's our nature. So to let go of anything, we can just notice that reaction to that change. Someone there noticing their attention was more easily focused with the eyes closed, but then experimented with kind of eyes open and closed. And someone's already picked their object back up. Always good to know. So yeah, someone else feeling kind of a sense of loss with that. And someone was creating an image of what they were holding. That's fascinating, and maybe something I could have brought in, actually, the sense of how we can so easily go into that kind of mind's representation of something. And is it wonderful that our mind can do that? If your eyes are closed, groping around at night, trying to maybe feel what just sounded like it thumped on the floor, then without light, you can bring to mind an object through that sense of contact, particularly with your hands. So you had to do someone. They're really interesting, saying they had to do something with their hands after they put the object down. Yeah. Someone noticed a lot of story with the object. Yeah. So thank you so much for those comments. So the reason for just another one that had gone by in a blur. I enjoy the reassurance that you were giving about doing what felt right. There wasn't a kind of right way of doing it. And someone saying that they realised the object, they'd borrowed it from a friend, and they must have stolen it by accident. So a lot of story about that. Fantastic. Great noticing with that. So someone did notice quite a lot of resistance to that as well. Thank you for that. And someone else saying the more they want to give the option of wandering off, the more they felt able to focus. So, and someone struck by the sound within the fine details. So that's really interesting. Another sense coming in. Thank you so much for those really interesting comments. I'll kind of anonymize those and link them to the session stuff when it's done. The purpose in kind of offering that as a way in is to me a practice like that, quite brief, hopefully for many people, but not for everyone. It maybe depends on the object chosen as well. Maybe reasonably familiar to do. Most of us are going to be holding objects in somewhere in our lives. Maybe something that feels immediately doable because it's familiar. There's a sense of, yeah, this is going to be something I can do. I'm not doing something that's new and different, and I'm kind of more focused in on the newness and the difference than maybe the actual practice itself. So in a way, we're isolating the new bit for someone beginning mindfulness in the what do you do with your attention when you're holding an object, rather than I'm learning a whole new way of being with my body or doing stuff, and I'm also doing mindfulness with that as well. And I'll touch back in on that a bit more. But also the brevity of that dipping out of the object into the hand, into the body, and then back in again. And possibly with a group I was less familiar with, I might have missed off the kind of feeling of absence at the end, but I was kind of curious about that myself when I kind of do that sort of practice. So I thought it was interesting to bring in here, but it might kind of spark who knows what. But the sense of how is it to be attentive to our body in different ways, quite a focused way in terms of just the hand, and then the broader way with the whole body. And if you can, particularly I think if you frame a practice as kind of giving things a test drive, let's see what people made of it. I'm really interested in maybe what didn't sit well with you, or you thought, goodness, what was that all about? I don't want to do that again. Anything like that. I think the sense of giving permission for people to say quickly how that was to be in more kind of embodied awareness, which that kind of later part of practice is about, gives you the opportunity as the person offering that practice, a very quick way of gauging someone's capacity for some degree of embodied awareness, and maybe in quite a safe way as well. That then opens up choices about where you might go with that. Maybe for someone who found that really unsettling, quite triggering, even if it's quite brief, maybe that's something you think, well, maybe other kinds of practices may be more helpful. Maybe it's staying with the object and not going into the wider sense of the body around that. So, so yeah. So I'll. In fact, when I was kind of preparing, having said I was going to want to focus in on the body scan this session, I suddenly realised it's so huge, all the different things to talk about, kind of body scan wise, that actually I can really only pick up one thread in this session. And what I want to do in a future session is look at other ways of bringing embodiment into our awareness that aren't centered around what we could call a classic body scan. But yeah, that'll be kind of that thread of what we might be doing there with that object. I can pick up in a future session. There's an interesting quote there. Comment there. I'm probably going to stop looking at the comments from this point on until we next have a bit, because it's too split awareness for me. But does this therefore work only regarding the not so newness with an item that participants are familiar with? Yeah, their own. So I think that's a really useful question. And again, maybe there's a question there about how confident you are with the person you're offering a body scan to, what they might make to something new or something familiar. I remember Annette and I, when we first started, way back in about 2008, we were kind of thinking about how to bring embodied awareness. We had this great idea, we thought, of using a person's set of keys as a focus for mindfulness practice. A really good embodied practice, lots of different shapes. Most people have keys of some sort with them. And it was a deeply profound beginning practice, because there were people there who said, there's a key on there of mum from my mum's house, and she died 5 years ago. I've never been able to take it off the key ring. And it took them into really profound grief around that sense of loss that was connected to that key. And other similar stories that we realized that a key ring, perhaps Annette and myself a bit more utilitarian, but key rings having this kind of deeply meaningful processes around them that can be joyful and really saddening. So it might be interesting just to try something really neutral, possibly like, a pen, or, a piece of paper, or something that's just quite bland, or something, that person is kind of routinely familiar with. Phones are quite interesting, with them off. Just something most people will have some contact with. And I'm always a sucker for a drink, so having, a hot drink, a cold drink, something like that was maybe quite a familiar object. That familiarity may be helpful. So I don't think there's like all this stuff, I don't think there's a kind of right or wrong answer. I think it's just interesting to think about. I think it's interesting to ask the questions around this stuff. So thank you for that. Okay, I wanted to dip a little bit, just kind of set this body scan thinking up with a little bit around some PowerPointy stuff. And then I want to kind of go much more practical after that. So let me just share the screen. So here we go. And these will be, for people who are concerned about this, the recording will be available after this session, which will have these few slides. So I think just to start this off, I think it's really useful to check in about how embodiment and trauma might be linked together. And fundamentally, we're embodied beings. If you're finding some images that kind of overlapping the slides, I do try to keep them more to one side, but there's a little button at the top of the kind of gallery of pictures on the side that you can reduce everything down a bit if they're in the way. So we're embodied beings, and that's a really dynamic process. Our experience of embodiment continually unfolds with just how we are in different moments and what our body's up to, and how we are experiencing our embodiment influences how we are embodied. So the whole thing is deeply entangled up, and it's an unfolding story that's wonderfully complicated. And from when I did medicine many years ago to where we are now, in terms of just the intricacies of the networks at all kinds of levels that come into our experience of embodiment, it's amazing. I suspect we'll never be able to get to the bottom of that, partly because we all unfold individually. So one person's way of being embodied is different to another's. And I think it's quite hard to think of how traumatic experiences that remain unresolved in some way don't distance us from our body in some way. And the healing of trauma brings us closer to our body. Yes, there's all kinds of things happening more inwardly, mentally, emotionally, our kind of felt sense in the back of everything, but or through everything. But our sense of how we can be with what our body echoes in terms of how trauma has affected us is kind of part and parcel of that whole process of becoming traumatized and healing from that trauma. And I'm going to use the term classic body scan to mean the types of body scan that typically are undertaken lying down with the body held or at least an invitation for the body to be held still throughout, but for breathing, which sometimes may be an instruction forgotten, where all the body areas are kind of encountered in a scan through, and typically a longer period of 20 to 45 minutes. I want to kind of frame that as being the kind of classic body scan I was trained to offer. And although I think there's a lot of changing thoughts about this, this can still be kind of held as a as a kind of body scan proper, as it were, maybe. So, and I wanted to put this in bold because absolutely for some people, a classic body scan practice encounter at the beginning of their kind of journey into mindfulness and self-compassion can be profoundly healing and transformational. And in the context of intense and maybe in other contexts of the person's life, overwhelming trauma. So there's nothing intrinsically kind of wrong about body scan practices. The kind of weasel word I've put in there, though, is the can, because for some people, a classic body scan is a difficult practice that difficulty may colour their ongoing experience of what it is to practice mindfulness. And it may just be tedious, boring, kind of difficult, of that kind of level, or it may be that it's triggering of profoundly difficult trauma experiences, or may even create traumatic experiences in its own right in some way. So I think thinking about the context in which a body scan is being offered, particularly a classic type of body scan, I think is really important. And then there's going to be contexts where it's absolutely fine, like working with a group of people who practice yoga. Probably, I wouldn't say, in any guaranteed way, but just overall, a group of people who practice a lot of body awareness, and there's similarities of a yoga nidra, a body scan, may mean actually there's a group that want to jump straight in, and most folk there might be okay. But then maybe actually doing it differently could bring to the surface things that people weren't aware of. And I want to just think about, and I mentioned this in the email sent out, think about this notion of the window of tolerance is a really useful model, I think, for understanding this. Please look at the previous video I did for the detail of this. But when we're inside our window of tolerance, we have the capacity to hold steady with what's challenging. We have the capacity to stay connected with stuff that may not be always easy, but we can be there with what's kind of unfolding. And because of this, we can learn new things. We can expand our repertoire of responses to how it is to be in our life, and we can lay down new habits that open up kind of new possibilities. Whereas if we are taken outside that window of tolerance through our kind of sympathetic reactions, these hyperarousal reactions take us into alarm and panic, or through cut off or shut down when our more kind of older ancient parasympathetic ones are coming active, then what starts to happen is our learning stops or becomes more and more difficult, until really when we're hijacked by panic or shut down, we're just running old protective habit patterns. Habit patterns that may well have allowed us to survive to this point and be here. So there's nothing, again, wrong with these things. It's just that maybe they are limiting if that's the only things we have in our repertoire. And I want to really pick up on this notion that if we want to learn new habits, it's really good to be in that window of tolerance. If we want to be reinforcing old habits, then that's what tends to happen when we're outside that window of tolerance. So thinking about that, then to kind of unpack what's happening in a classic body scan, there's a lot going on. We need to have a set of capacities established to be able to do a classic body scan from beginning to end, with maybe only minor deviations out of that window of tolerance, but have the capacity to come back in. So we need to have the capacity to steady ourselves, that if something As we take our attention through the body for that length of time just becomes too much, then we can come back into focus rather than staying off in whatever ways we're choosing to get through, or reaction patterns are coming in to get us through that experience. We need some capacity for attention to be able to focus in, return our attention when things hook our attention, and to be able to redirect from one place to another. Particularly, there's something about some parts of our body which may, perhaps through being in pain or having very strong associations, may be very magnetic in their quality, but take us into kind of difficult experiences around that. Some capacity for embodied awareness, because otherwise, where is your attention going to go if there ain't a body there? I spelled engagement on that. So some capacity for that is really important. Otherwise, you're just going to be off in some other world. And how effective is that in your learning, or doing your shopping list in your head? So for 20 to 40 minutes of not knowing you've got a body there is going to be a tough call, even if it's just a boring call. And perspective taking, some capacity, which kind of links into steadying yourself, to be able to know what's happening as it happens within this context, more open awareness. So when you're noticing your attention has been taken off somewhere, then to be able to notice that your attention has shifted from one place to another, which requires you to be holding different aspects of your experience in awareness, in that kind of open awareness, with some degree of objectivity about that. Yeah, my attention was there, now it's here. Now maybe I can bring it back. Otherwise, again, I'm going to be hooked by stuff and maybe not able to kind of have any wider sense of what's happening. So that's kind of just in the process of the body scan. But if we add in things like the length of practice, and if there's any discomfort along the way, then yes, this has the potential for resilience building. But I would say only really if that is within someone's window of tolerance and they have the capacity to meet that experience, with minor kind of brief digressions out maybe into alarm and cut off, but knowing how to come back in again. And further complications may come in. If you use breath imagery, you're asking people to not only have these skills, but if you're saying, kind of imagine your breath flowing down to your foot, and as you're breathing in and out, your attention's kind of moving in and out of that part of the body with your breath. This is a kinesthetic, a felt sense imagery practice. And this will be available to some people, but not available to others. It depends on what kind of inner representational modalities. They may be more visual, maybe more auditory, maybe less kinesthetic. And so that may actually just send someone in a spin. I was kind of okay with some bits, but what was that breath thing all about? And then the self-compassion. Some body scans may be really offering a lot around self-compassion. If that's available, that may allow you to bring that into the context of this embodied awareness. But if that's a big reach, way beyond what you're familiar with, or even quite triggering in its own way, bringing up maybe unmet need, then maybe some sensitivity is needed around that. And then all of this is in the context of asking maybe a group of people to possibly lie down on the floor with a bunch of strangers, maybe even getting on the floor on a yoga mat or pad is kind of new for them. Maybe that's with invitations to, if you possibly can, stay still, don't move, which then maybe set up the person, say, well, what kind of movements are allowed? Maybe, which is a thing that used to really freak me out in some body scans, being invited to put an eye bag over your eyes. So you can't even easily open your eyes and look around. And I felt when I was kind of invited to do this as a fairly confident person in the training I did, I thought I spent most of that first body scan with an eye bag on my eyes, just thinking, just a minute, how does infection control work with these kind of soft bean bags that are put on eyes? They just came out of a bag there. What kind of conjunctive? Anyway, so I went off into quite a bit of kind of thinking about the infection control risk of eye bags, which I don't know, I've not seen around so much, but think about that in terms of how someone might feel, I can't even look to see what's around. So, and talking to some people who really struggle with body scans, thinking about what it would be like to be laying down on the floor with strangers, maybe becoming increasingly overwhelmed by what's going on. Kind of what the hell do you do? If you're kind of there on a course because you're really struggling with various kind of issues in your life, you may not have the confidence to be able to get up and leave the room with any sense of your own kind of self intact without that being maybe deeply shaming. So I think there's ways in which that first experience is set up that means not only are we learning about how it is to be attentive to our body, but we're also learning about what it is to be maybe in a new position lying on the floor and maybe staying still when I haven't ever stayed still before, and maybe doing this with a bunch of strangers who I don't really know that well because it's maybe the first session we've been together, and a teacher I don't know that well, so I'm not quite sure what the rules are. It's a lot going on, and maybe I've thrown in the breath imagery and a bit of self-compassion to boot. Who knows what might be happening? So from the very best of intentions, I think we can be asking a huge amount of people to get the best learning out of that experience. And really what I want to focus on tonight is how we might unpack the kind of intent of the body scan and but kind of reform it in a way that maybe helps people into that experience a little bit more easily. And I think there is this fundamental contradiction that is there in a classic body scan, because we're kind of saying a body scan is inviting mindful awareness to the whole body and to each part of the body, and also to the reactions evoked from bringing mindful awareness to the whole body in each part. And to have the capacity to do this throughout a classic body scan without being taken outside a window of tolerance requires there to be an established capacity for mindful embodied awareness for the whole body and the parts to some extent, and the reactions evoked. And if, when we're trying to do this, we go outside of our window of tolerance for any prolonged period of we haven't yet learned to self-soothe or re-steady ourselves, which may be why we're on the course, because actually we're struggling to steady ourselves in the midst of difficulties. That's one of our learning aims, perhaps, through learning mindfulness. Then what tends to happen is we reinforce the old habits that get us through and have got us maybe through to being able to be kind of here today doing this body scan. But are we really wanting a practice to reinforce old ways of doing things rather than introduce new possibilities? And I think really importantly, what does that set up for someone if they think, oh yeah, this mindfulness course is somewhere where I've got to do all that stuff again? It's going to be happening to some extent, come what may. But if it's a really vivid experience of having to do it to get through, rather than just kind of dipping in and out, what does that set up in people's minds? So kind of you have to be able to do a classic body scan to be able to do one. And so there's a bit of a contradiction in that. So what to do? So in this session, the key thing I want to do is to think about some ways maybe of adapting that session one body scan just to ease into a kind of embodied awareness where we're taking our attention through our body in some way. And as I was thinking more about the session, having put the title up, then in future sessions, I want to think more about how we could deconstruct a body scan and think about how we could achieve the same aims through different practices, so that maybe we end up with the capacity to do a body scan a little later on for some groups we might be working with, but still achieving what a body scan can achieve. And then another session, I'd really like to explore more about what all this business about embodiment is about. Because I think, as someone who is fascinated by kind of neurology and psychology, I think that's really interesting in its own right. I will send these out, put these links out kind of when I email out after the session, but the particular practice I'm going to explore this evening, this kind of idea of a looped body scan, you'll find there's some teacher's notes there, but we're about to change our website. So we're going to be moving into a new website, and I'm not sure whether our old links will easily survive. So you might want to sign up to our newsletter. And again, I'll put a link up that, which would re-link to those resources. And the loop body scan, I'm going to mention again, there's some versions of that within our SoundCloud area. So you can get a sense of doing that. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on this evening. So I will stop sharing. That's the last of the slides. It's quite enough of that of an evening. Can I suggest, there's a bit of a blur there, so maybe we just have a couple of minutes comfort break, just have a stretch around move, just to catch up with ourselves. So if we're back at mine in, say, 5 minutes, just to be back at, I'm going to say 18 minutes past 8 by my computer. So let's just have a brief break there, and I'll pick up the. So maybe get yourself comfortable if you want to do a bit of a body scan type stuff in your own sort of way.
I like the business, but I don't